Thank you. Good afternoon to all.
Buenas tardes a todos.
I thank you for this opportunity to be together with you,
Esta posibilidad de poder estar reunidos con ustedes para
to be able to be discussing,
poder estar disertando.
I also thank Manuel's glorious words,
Palabras de Manuel,
because clearly trying to double the status quo is not easy.
tratar de doblegar al statu quo no es fácil.
The reality is that the processes of change, when one studies the processes of change, always generate resistance to the status quo, and the stronger that process of change, obviously the resistance is even much greater.
La resistencia es aún muchísimo mayor. Y
Decades and decades have accumulated ideas in the wrong direction,
ideas en la dirección incorrecta.
so it is also very difficult,
También se hace muy difícil
because parts of the process implies understanding
comprender que
that those things with which we were used to think
estábamos acostumbrados a pensar
are obviously not right and we have to change them.
no están bien y hay que cambiarlas.
And that also requires even much longer.
Todavía muchísimo más
I say that it is the part linked to cultural change.
vinculada al cambio cultural.
What we should be aware of is that Argentina entered the 20th century
Es que Argentina entró al siglo
as a developed country, and it is the only country that, being developed, became subdeveloped.
se convirtió en subdesarrollado.
And it seems quite self-critical for those who have defended that model,
Poco autocrítico para aquellos que han defendido ese modelo,
to claim that that is the solution,
que esa es la solución cuando
when in reality that is a model that sank us.
que nos hundió.
Violating the budget restriction is not free.
Esto no es gratis.
That is why it was shocking as the idea of no money came to people.
Bastante cómo llegó a la gente la idea del no hay plata.
That is, we all suffer from no money regularly.
Las padecemos regularmente. Y
And Argentina, that was not cheap to have systematically violated
barato haber violado sistemáticamente
the budget restriction.
presupuesto.
Argentina, during the 20th century, for example, while the United States had 4 crises, Argentina had 22. And when you look at the Argentine crisis throughout the 20th century,
A lo largo del siglo XX,
the common feature of all the crises is that they have a fiscal deficit
es que tiene un déficit fiscal que
that is either high or unmeasurably high.
desmesuradamente alto.
In fact, the most emblematic crises in Argentina have levels of truly obscene fiscal deficit, either as in the case of Al Rodriguez in 1975, when we had a fiscal deficit of 14 points of the GDP,
Del PBI,
or the exchangeable table in 1981, which had 11.
81 que tenía 11.
Alfonso's hyperinflation occurred with 8 and the convertibility failed with 7. Well, we received 15 fiscal deficits between the Treasury and the Central Bank,
Entre el Tesoro y el Banco Central.
which was a fiction,
Una ficción.
because basically the Treasury generated a fiscal deficit,
El Tesoro generaba déficit
financed it with monetary missions.
monetaria,
Enter another window, the Central Bank was trade those pesos
daba esos pesos
and ended up paying 10 points of the GDP.
del PBI.
So basically, we had a fiscal deficit of 15 points of GDP.
Teníamos un déficit fiscal de 15 puntos del PBI.
And also, some proposals are incredible,
Algunas propuestas
because it is assumed that when one goes through the public administration and has this task of carrying out either the country
digamos, esta tarea de llevar a cabo ya sea el
either a
país,
province
sea
or a
un
municipality,
ya sea un municipio,
it is assumed that in the middle one should learn what the budgetary restriction was.
entender que era la restricción presupuestaria.
I mean, I say it this way because days ago the former governor Esqualreti
Días atrás, el ex gobernador
criticized us for what we were doing
nosotros por lo que estábamos haciendo
and made a
y hacía
proposal
una
to spend more.
propuesta de gastar más
Very nice. It sounded very nice. The truth was that it sounded very nice. But it implied raising the fiscal deficit to 7 points of the GDP. So the question is, what are we going to finance it with? With monetary emissions, we are going to generate a hyper. We are going to finance it with debt. In a context like the current one, where in the face of political panic, that is being spiralized in the market and generating a huge discoordination in terms of country risk. A country that has deficit zero, I mean, one of the 5 countries in the world that has deficit zero. That led to the debt-product ratio of levels close to 100 to 44. And that when we look at debt with the market, it is around 25%. That say, and this still happens. I mean, imagine with a fiscal deficit of 7 points of the GDP, or in terms of taxes, I would like to know. Because for each point of the GDP we need, for example, 3 points of IVA taxes. So I would ask the former Governor Schiaretti if he is thinking of taking the IVA to 42%. I mean, if he is thinking of financing that gastronomic madness. I sinking more people into poverty, taking the IVA to 42%, because we would need 21 more points of IVA, for example. So what is the alternative? Spend to generate a hyperinflation, spend to sink our children, grandchildren and future generations, or kill people of hunger by suddenly raising the IVA? So, I mean, breaking with a circle of demagogy. Is also a non-minor issue. Because, I mean, 2 plus 2 is still 4. And it seems that in Argentine politics, people refuse to see it. It's like wanting to deny the law of gravity. The law of gravity is not cruel. I mean, but if you threw yourselves off a 50-story building, it would going to crash. I mean, nobody would dare to say that the law of gravity is cruel. Well, the budget restriction is. That's why the example that Alfredo Caseros have made with Flan was so great, right? I mean, he had finished burning the house, and he shouted that he wanted Flan. No, but he burned the house. I want Flan. But I mean, there's no ice cream. I want Flan. No, but I mean, you don't have a house. I want Flan. I mean, it seems that Argentine politics is obsessed with that. I mean, systematically violating the budget restriction. I mean, or if it's financed with money. Who do you think they're going to hurt? Are they going to say that they are protecting the most vulnerable with monetary emissions? I mean, with inflationary taxes. I mean, it seems to me that they didn't figure out that it's the most regressive tax of all. Therefore, one also finds himself not only with the one who has to manage, but also has to fight and break the demagogy. As Manuel mentioned in the intro that he made, I thank you very much, Manuel, for your generosity. Argentina, probably, when we arrived, we received the worst inheritance in history, because we had a monetary imbalance, a money overhand, which was twice what Rodriguez had in the previous one, which meant doubling the inflationary rate. Therefore, we were going to multiply the inflationary rate by 12. Not only that, but we also had an imbalance in the balance sheet of the central bank, bigger than the what Alfonsín had in the previous one of the hyperinflation. Alfonsín had remunerated passes on the basis of 3. We had 4. In other words, in one day, we could double the amount of money. We had worse social indicators than in 2001. At the time of arrival, even the dishonest ones. We also had a tax deficit of 5 points of the GDP in the Treasury, 10 points of the GDP in the central bank. We had debt in pesos beating very quickly. by the equivalent of 9 monetary bases. We had the agreement with the fund drop. We also had commercial debts in the central bank. This era for more than $40 billion. We have net reserves negative for $11.5 billion. There was a gap of 200%. The country's risk at the time we won the elections was around 3,000 basis points. And inflation is very interesting to see the evolution, because it ended up traveling at levels of 211% in the year. But when you look, for example, the mobile averages, the shorter the mobile average, the higher it was. And obviously the highest it was the one at the top, either in the consumer at 25%, either in wholesale at 54%, or basically the inflation measured in daily terms was at 1.5%. That is to say, hyperinflation was on the way. That was the inheritance that we received. That was what had to be resolved. And beyond the discussions and some issues that one can do, we need that it was fundamental to end inflation and to end inflation. We had to end the emission. That is, we consider that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon that is generated by an excess of money supply, either because the supply went up or because the demand fell. Both things happened at the same time. That generated the loss of purchasing power, the money, and all the prices expressed in monetary units go up. And that essentially required to put the treasury in the box and put the central bank in the box to cut once and for all with the monetary emission. So there, I want to get more into the positive part. What lessons have we learned from all this? At least in this short time, and the reason why I'm called from different universities in the world to just explain what has happened in Argentina. Because here it was held that inflation was not monetary, but multi-causal. They said that if we made the adjustment, it was going to be hyper-recessive, and that there was going to be a large increase in unemployment and poor people. And not to mention all the discussion about the exchange rate and the prices, and basically the order in the streets. So we made a fiscal adjustment. In the first month of management, after 123 years of fiscal deficit, which no one arranged in 123 years, in the first month of government we put the fiscal accounts in order. That is something that seemed impossible over the course of 123 years, yet we did it in a month. Not only that, but we began to work on cleaning up the central bank's balance sheet to finish with the fiscal deficit, and something that no one in politics made a proposal about. And in reality, it was a real time bomb. It was resolved in 6 months. That is to say that throughout the first semester of 2024, we not only put the fiscal account in order, but we also finished with the monetary emission. And from there we began to discuss two concepts, which is the wide monetary base and the observed monetary base. And instruments had been created so that as the demand for money was being recomposed. That would endogenously generate an expansion of the monetary base in the traditional format supply that demand for money, and that the roof was going to happen when the two concepts of the monetary base touched. But in the face of that adjustment, they considered that inflation was not going to go down, and that it could not go down in any way. From 30% in minority groups, and to the surprise of many, it went down to 30%. Then we were not going to be able to go down to 10%. It went down to 10%. Then we were not going to be able to go down to 8%. It went down to 8%. Then it could not go down to 4%. It went down to 4%. And today inflation travels between 1.5% and 2%, 4 months ago. That is to say that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, because Friedman, when he said and gave that phrase, added that monetary policy has ups and downs. Those ups and downs in Argentina are estimated to be between 18 and 24 months. In fact, a recent study by the University of Cordoba, a student of the University of Cordoba, who taught him the thesis, a very dear friend of mine, Enrique Neder, proved that the lags in monetary policy in Argentina is 26 months. Therefore, if Argentina continues with this policy to maintain the amount of money for half of next year, inflation in Argentina will have been just a bad memory that will have ended. Therefore, at least we already have a lesson, and that is that money is what causes inflation. Not only did we learn that lesson, we also learned another lesson, that one could make a fiscal adjustment, and that the fiscal adjustment could be expansive. In the literature of economic policy, especially since some works of Alesina, there was the idea of the expansive adjustment, which was that you put the public accounts in boxes, and that made the country's risk fall strongly, and that allowed an expansion. However, we believe that there is another way also to face the adjustment, and that the adjustment was expansive. The key always in the adjustment is that when you make an adjustment, the opposite of that is that in reality, what you are doing is increasing the savings. So if the counterpart of the savings has a rise in investment, that adjustment can be expansive. We considered that if that adjustment fell on the non-productive sector of the country, that is, the state, and the adjustment fell on the state, unlike other experiences that were always done by increasing taxes, and therefore that made the investment expand, and consequently the economy focused on a recession. We considered that if the increase in savings was due to reduction of public spending, that was going to release resources to the private sector, and that was going to expand the economy. When it was proposed in the campaign, it looked like a theoretical discussion or a campaign speech. Well, that's what we did. In fact, not only did we make the adjustment, but throughout 2024 we lowered taxes by the equivalent of 2.5 points of the GDP. That is, with which automatically, not only that the adjustment was not recessive, and as they predicted that we were going to sink into a Great Depression and others, the Argentine economy came with a statistical drag. That is, when we arrived, the economy was already in recession, and this statistical drag was 3% of the GDP. If the GDP of 2024 ended with a drop of about 7, it is because it means that at some point it began to rebound. The moment when the Argentine economy touched the bottom was in April of 2024. And from there, the Argentine economy began to expand. And when the year 2024 ended in December, the EMI station, which is the monthly estimator of the economic activity, ended with 6 percentage points above December. That is, we also proved that an adjustment could be made. That was expansive. That is, whenever that adjustment fell on parasitic sector of the economy, which is the state. That is, shrinking the state generated in the expansion. That is, we made an adjustment that was expansive. So we not only managed to lower inflation aggressively, we not only managed to avoid hyperinflation, but also the recomposition of public accounts that led to an expansion of the economy. In fact, that expansion of the economy continued throughout the first and second trimesters of this year, because basically the observation of the data of the first trimester is 5.7 up compared to the previous year, and 6.3. But of course, from the month of March, February, March, the policy does not stop putting sticks in the wheel. I say there is a poisoning for destroying everything we have built. That is, throughout this year, the most irrational part of Argentine policy, the only thing it tries to do is to break the macroeconomic balance. And that is why they took out more than 40 laws against us. The truth is that the criticism that is made of politics is quite naive, to say the least, because they should never forget that we seemed with 15% of the House of Representatives and less than 10% of the senators. In other words, everything we did in the first year is incredible. I think that, in fact, they gave us all those things because they thought it was not going to work. Because, in addition, all this process was accompanied by almost 9,000 structural reforms. And the most interesting thing is that the adjustment can be expansive. Argentina still has the GDP today at maximum production levels. That is, in line with those we had in 2011. And I remember that they also said that we were going to make poverty multiply enormously. And the reality is that if one took this to the monthly frequency of the poverty analysis, to contemplate the things that are hidden behind an average when a variable is growing, or what is implied to have had price controls, and then countably they had a level of poverty. But when they went to the market it was different, because they couldn't find the legume product. They had to go look elsewhere. When you correct all those things, that is reflected in the poverty indicator that follows tighter, and it was in the order of 54 and 57%, according to when they start. And today that indicator is at 30%. That is, this government took 12 million Argentines out of poverty. There are also 6 million Argentines who did not eat, and today they eat because they got out of poverty. Therefore, not only did we put public accounts in order, but we also lowered inflation, and we also took people out of poverty. That is, it seems that we have found the machine of prosperity. Does it mean that the problems are over? No, in no way am I saying that the problems are over. That is, we know that having 30% of the poor is hyper painful. It's like being halfway. I say the reality is that the question is, what do we do?
¿Qué hacemos?
And I would say, look, let's not sack off, let's keep going. Do we miss a lot? Yes, but we have achieved a lot. We have to make all that effort worth it. All that effort that we have just made during these almost 20 months, that is worth that we have to keep going. That is, and then sometimes they say they do not listen. I say, what do they want me to listen to? The recipe that failed for 100 years. What do they want? That we return to the tax deficit, to the monetary mission, to the monetary exchange control. I say, we already know what that recipe is. It left 57% poor, 70% per children. We run the edge of the hyperinflation. I say, that is not a solution. So what we are asking at this moment is that we do not slack off. That we know that it is hard, that it is missing, but we are halfway there. Therefore, we have to move forward. That is, we have to continue, we have to keep pushing. Why? Because on the other side is the path of prosperity. The other fallacy that we have also managed to destroy is the fallacy of the past tree.
La otra falacia que también hemos logrado destruir es la falacia del paso.
That is the transfer of devaluation to prices. And the reality is that given this destructive behavior of the state party,
La realidad es que dado este comportamiento destructivo del partido del Estado,
basically we have had a lot of volatility.
básicamente hemos tenido muchísima volatilidad.
It has been translated into a lot of volatility in the exchange rate.
En el tipo de cambio.
However, the wholesale inflation continues around 1.5 and 2%.
Minorista continúa en torno al 1,5 y el 2%.
And that, look at the demand for money, they are shaking it off.
Miren que la demanda de dinero la están sacudiendo del Olimpo.
So the reality is that it is also.
Entonces, la realidad es que también
It is good to understand how the price system works.
Cómo funciona el sistema de precios.
And it seems to me that it is also an interesting lesson to not make certain mistakes for the future. Now, there is also something that is very important. And that if there had not been this setback, all these things could not have been achieved. That is, we have done wonderful things in terms of lowering inflation, in terms of recomposing the issue of debt. In fact, the debt dropped $50 billion. We had $500 billion when we arrived. Today it is $450 billion. That is, we are the first government to pay so off much debt. That is, we paid that in 20 months we lower the debt to $50 billion. That is why it went from 100% to 44. But, and also we made the 9,000 structural reforms. Also all the work of Sandro Petovilo in human capital. But clearly this would not have been possible if there was no order in the street. And I also want to thank the enormous work of Minister Boric, who is here with us. To Minister Boric, also the Argentines, we have a great debt to her. Because she is a true patriot. Because when on October 22, 23, in light of the electoral result, she had enormous generosity in redirecting her political force to support us on the ballot. And that was what allowed me to have the possibility of being president of the Argentine nation. And thanks to her greatness and her interest in being a good Argentine, a patriot, Dr. Boric spoke with former President Mauricio Macri,
La doctora Bullrich habló con el expresidente Mauricio Macri.
and together they decided to support us. We came to the presidency and we were able to do many enormous things throughout the first year and months of the government. And we are confident that we will be able to continue doing it from here onwards. Because we have already seen who is in front of us. We have already seen the outcasts back. So let's say we will continue working to make a better Argentina, so that we can get out of populism and get ahead of everyone. But beyond that greatness, she also carried out a huge task, which was to put order in the streets. That is, Minister Pedavilo had identified the nexus, where the nexus had to be broken between social benefits and the moment people arrived, where the poor managers were in the middle, and they had to cut there. Cutting the cables there was not so easy. In fact, they said it was impossible. When we arrived, there were 9,000 pickets a year, while Minister Boric took it to zero. That is, with the anti-picket protocol. And that allowed us to have order in the streets. He returned the order to Argentina. With that order, there is no progress either. So I think there are several lessons to learn from these 20 months. That we have been in power. Obviously, in an electoral year. Let's say, and where the only proposal that the state party has is to destroy. Because the only proposal they have is to destroy. I mean, they say openly. I say to all those who are here, who are entrepreneurs, they know what it costs to build. I say, building is something that requires a lot of work, and it can be destroyed very easily. Think of the building rate. He can build a skyscraper, and then with the internal implosion system, he can make it disappear in very little time. So if we become aware of the monster that is in front of us, I think society will reflect again. If this October 26th, it will paint the country purple. And this is beyond a survey or what one may be looking at. It is the principle of pure revelation. If they were to win according to how big they are, surely they would not be trying to break everything all the time. So part of what they're seeing, part of the challenge, part of all the problems that are being driven from the state party is the opposite, because they know they are losing. So they want to break everything to get a better result. But we are going to keep fighting. We are going to keep moving forward. We are not going to give up in any way, because we came to make Argentina great again. And we are not going to stop in that task in any way. Thank you very much. But beyond that, I would like to give you some guidelines. And why we are the party of hope. Why we are hope. Why it is possible to make Argentina great again. In what was in the chain, in the presentation of the budget.
en la presentación del presupuesto,
Basically, I explained that Argentina in 10 years
expliqué que Argentina en 10 años
could become a country of high income.
convertir en un país de altos ingresos,
In 20 years to be with the world's main powers,
codearse con las potencias, las principales potencias mundiales,
and in 30 years it could be in the top
y
3.
en 30 años podía estar en el top 3.
So now what I am going to do is give you the basics of why that is possible. To achieve something like that, one would have to chain at least a couple of decades together offering at 7%.
A tasas del 7%.
In fact, in the convergence processes, there are countries that have managed to grow at rates of 10% for 14 years, which is equivalent. Think that when you study growth, there is a rule that is called the 70 rule, which is used to determine how many years the GDP doubles. So, for example, if you grow at 10%, you double in 7 years. Who did this? For example, China did it. China chained 2 periods of 7 years growing at 10. That implies multiplying the GDP by 4. That is not that it was not done, it was done. In fact, I am going to tell you something. When Argentina took place a liberal miracle, from the arrival of requisite power, with the Constitution of Liberty in 1953, Argentina, a country of barbarians, became the first world power. If you take the re-estimation of Madison, it can be third, but it is still a miracle. And basically, when you look at the rate at which Argentina grew, relative to the world, it is higher than the Chinese rates with respect to the world. So if we did it in the 19th century, why can't we do it in the 21st century? That is the only thing to have is confidence. But above all things, courage. And I believe that the Argentines, after so much resilience, after so many bad things, if there is something that we have, it is strength and courage to do it. But again, what are the foundations for this? The first is the fiscal balance. There is a wonderful study that Juan Pablo Nicolini did recently. I say that he is an economist from the University of Ila, that Guido knows obviously, and that also works in the Federal Reserve, and he showed that with just achieving the fiscal balance, the Argentine economy could grow systematically to 4%. And speaking with Professor Nicolini, one of the things that he told me that is true, but also that it did not make any difference if the fiscal balance was achieved by raising taxes or lowering expenses. And clearly it is not the same. Therefore, a solution made from the reduction of the state results in a higher growth rate. In addition, that leads to a reduction in the debt-product ratio. Inexorably, I understand the problems of the electoral dynamics and the current situation in the markets. But Argentina is one of the 5 countries in the world that has fiscal balance. In other words, in almost 200 countries in the world, only 5 have fiscal balance. We are one of them. In other words, if you notice, all the panic is political. Therefore, if on October 26 we paint Argentina in violet, the Argentine dream will be possible to make Argentina great again. Another element that is also very important. When you have inflation, you generate a distortion of relative prices. And that distortion of relative prices punishes economic growth. In the middle of next year, inflation will have been history. Therefore, that will imply a leap in the GDP level. That is going to be a leap in the GDP level. That is, it will be once and for all. It will manifest itself as greater growth, but it is an effect once and for all. But it will exist, and it is not less, because then growth will escalate over it. But not only that. In different presentations, Minister Luis Toto Caputo also talked about what our tax reform would be. And it is a tax reform intended to lower taxes, not to raise taxes. And our hypothesis is that if we manage to chain a sequence of growth rates around 6-7%, from here to 2031, we would be returning to Argentines a reduction of taxes of $500 billion. That is more than what we owe today as a country. And that is indeed a shock. In addition, another element that played an important role in growth is the enormous work that Dr. Federico Sturzenegger does in the Ministry of Regulation. I am going to tell you a story that is very important. I'm going to tell you a story that basically shows the foundations of what we are doing. When I had to be part of the G7 meeting, invited by the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, she invited me to talk about artificial intelligence and economic growth. And basically, one of the central axes of my presentation had to do with the fact that all the dystopian scenarios that they propose about artificial intelligence had no sense, and that this was actually going to be something wonderful for the world, because it was going to imply an acceleration of the growth rate as a consequence of the increase in productivity. In fact, Dr. Riedo, who is also involved in nuclear energy and artificial intelligence issues, because obviously data centers need to be fed, and they need a lot of energy and a lot of stability. So when the meeting ended, while we were waiting for Pope Francis to arrive at Meloni, the car had just broken. It was a golf cart. But it broke, and they took a long time to get there. So we sat down with Kristolina Georgieva, talking about her presentation and my presentation. She had basically worked on an article by Keynes that was very little known. I was lucky enough to read it. I warn you that Keynes' full works are 30 volumes, and there are many who talk about the theory in general, and they didn't read it. I read the theory in general 5 times, but I also read a lot more about Keynes' works, not just the theory in general. It is difficult to categorize Keynes in some way, because it depends on the moment in Keynes' life, what they are going to read. It is not the same Keynes of the Treaty on Money as Keynes of the theory in general. It is not the same Keynes of the Treaty on Monetary Reform. It is not the same Keynes of the economic consequences of peace. It is difficult to categorize an author of these characteristics. But there is a very interesting article about Keynes last times, which is the economy for my grandchildren, and it shows how it is. And he is thinking about how the future would be. And in function of that, George Eva proposes an optimistic exercise where he says that the growth rate of the GDP per capita is 1 point higher. Obviously, I had in mind something much more radicalized. which is to revitalize the idea of the invisible hand, combined with the pin factory. The pin factory is the idea of growing yield. In fact, recently with Dr. Riedel, we have just demonstrated, and now we are looking for the newspaper that publishes what we did. We have managed to reconcile the idea of the invisible hand with a growing yield, that is, with the pin factory. That is to say that one can have an optimal income, even with growing yields. So, people who know about general balance and growth are going to appreciate this a lot. But the important thing is the practical consequences, that it is for the lives of human beings, and especially in Argentina, where we have a Ministry of Deregulation. So I told him this idea, that the problem with the neoclassical economics of wanting to replicate competitive markets, when the growing yields appeared, when the growing yields were associated with concentrated structures, a bunch of regulations were generated that ended up killing economic growth, and that what had to be done was to deregulate and release growing yields, which was what was going to generate economic growth. Well, imagine that such a torpedo to the neoclassical economics was not very comfortable for Kristalina Georgieva. But because of the dynamics that we have had, and that later led to the agreement in which we healed the assets of the central bank. In those stages, we had a meeting in New York, and when we sat down to talk, he told me, "You are right." I knew that I had to answer 4 questions, for I didn't know why I was right if I hadn't answered yet. So, if I hadn't answered yet, I said, "No, what you told me in Italy was right." I had put your economists to test the hypothesis of the relationship between regulation and growth, and they managed to prove my hypothesis that if you deregulate, you will grow. And that's how he asked me if I could, Federico, the Stesniger as part of the fund's advisors, to deregulate and generate economic growth. So this had started as a theoretical idea, and that we saw that it was working, was also validated in the empirical plane, and today it is a model to be copied all over the world. And clearly this is what is going to happen. Not only do we have a growth flow because of the fiscal balance, not only are we going to have more growth because the public spending has gone down, not only because the taxes are also going to go down, but also in terms of deregulation. We are going to continue going to the bone. Why? Because that is going to be in favor of the Argentines. It is going to enhance economic growth a lot more and grow the rates during the 7% convergence. It is going to be possible. And that is why we say that in 10 years, we are going to become a country of high income. In 20 years, in a potency, and in 30 years, one of the top 3 countries in the world. Because it can be done, and we are going to do it. Because not only do we know how to do it, but above all, we have the conviction. That is why we are going to do it. But our growth strategy does not stop there. In fact, when you look at the discussion in the literature of economic growth about what it is that explains economic growth, that debate has been held at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, with a work by Mankiw, David Whale, and David Roma.
Mankiw, David Whale, y David Romer.
Not Paul Roma, David Roma, of course, but it is not the same. And basically from that famous equation, a solo testing growth in 1957, it is a model of 1956. That increase in capital only explained 15%. When incorporating human capital technology, it jumped to 85%. That is, it explained 70 more points. And the discussion was over. This is technology. It is so much what we believe in that. In fact, I am going to tell you an anecdote. At the time that I lived in the supply department, and that we were only with an L, there was a painting in the living room of 1.5 meters by 1 meter of Gary Becker deriving the equation of intertemporal/. So imagine that from me, human capital technology, in addition to having 25 years behind, of giving macroeconomics classes, and of general balance, Gary Becker obviously has an important role. And there was such a tribute that I made to Gary Becker, arriving to the government, is that I put human capital to a ministry that integrates human capital from the first generation to the second generation. That is, who has to do with the part of feed and health. In fact, the health issue was so complex that it had a separate ministry, apart from the problems it had with that ministry and the difficulty, but they still work integrated in such a way as to ensure human capital in the first generation, because that is what allows that those young people can then study, can work. And we also work in what has to do with the reinsertion of those who have been displaced from the system, to give compensation to those who have a harder time coming back and working. The truth is that it worked, because lowering the number of poor to 11 million is not a minor issue. Taking out 6 million people who did not eat and eat. Therefore, it plays an important role. And within this is also the labor issue. Therefore, there will not only be reforms that lower regulations, but also this implies that we are going to move towards a more deregulated labor market. That is to say, part of its growth then has to do with continuing to deregulate in all markets, and also deregulate in the labor market. In other words, tax reform, labor reform, and a lot of economic deregulation forward. I give you a note of color. When Adela EU ship began to be torpedoed, it was because she wanted to do the labor reform. No matter what, those who are torpedoing are the same. They will not be able to stop the change. But not only that, we also have many sectors with great potential. What is the Argentine field? The cattle farm. What has to do with agro? The cattle farm. What has to do with mining? That we have the issue of lithium, gold, copper. The RIGI, in fact, brought $25 billion in investments, and there is a slope of 40 billion. That is, those who said that the RIGI was not going to work, well, it seems that it works. But not only that, everything we have in rare minerals, the revolution of oil and gas in Argentina, especially cattle, also what we have to do in nuclear energy, where we are advancing the construction of the EMRs, that is, the modular systems, which are also scalable, and it is a safe energy. Therefore, we are working a lot on nuclear development. We have made an agreement with France, which are the main producers of this type of technology. And we also have uranium, so we are in conditions to be an important player. In fact, Argentina is sitting on the table of important players. Wow, we want to be even more important. And that all will facilitate all the development of artificial intelligence that we are thinking that could take place in the South. And finally, another non-minor issue, and that is the issue of commercial opening. In other words, once we advance in the tax reform, once we advance in the labor reform, we will be in condition to open the economy more without having a negative social cost. In other words, here, the sequence is very important. It is not the same to open the economy and then to open, to regulate the labor market, and then lower taxes. That would be deeply painful for the population. That is why it is to lower taxes, after lowering taxes, after regulating the labor market, then to open and enter a permanent loop. In that sense, we have also been advancing and working very strongly in a trade agreement with the United States, where Argentina would be having a much better deal than the rest of the countries. But also, we have deepened our relationship with the South, and we are working very quickly and advancing much more than what have been advanced so far in the agreement with the European Union. And days ago, we also closed the agreement with AFTA. So we also work to make Argentina a more open country every day. Therefore, the key value drivers so that Argentina can grow are for speed. They are for speed. Probably we had a small pause as a consequence of the volatility that the state party is creating. But Tina died that if on October 26, we paint Argentina in purple, we are going to start down the road to the promised land, and Argentina will be great again. Thank you very much, and long live freedom. Culture.